All right, let's talk composition. So what makes good composition? First, let's talk proportion, which is basically how do things fit together and relate to each other in terms of size and scale, whether they're big, small, nearby, or distant. This is the most obvious quality of of composition. And we always talk about proportion quite frequently. So make that something that you're conscious and aware of. The relative scale of things in relationship to each other is important in composing images. We also want to think emphasis and focus, like where is the viewer's eye drawn? This is probably one of the most essential elements to composition. Doesn't matter how simple or complex your images are. Your goal is to determine whether it's contrast, whether it's balance, rhythm, or movement, because all of those elements are designed for us to make a conscious effort to figure out how do we make things in our piece stand out and make them important. So we need to go into every composition with the understanding of where is our focus at. And we'll talk focal point a number of times. Even inside of drawing individual elements, we want to be able to create a specific focus and then from there create supporting elements around it. Same thing, balance and unity, is we definitely want to think about, are all these elements working together? Are we trying to create really symmetrical compositions? Because the more symmetrical it is, the more ordered it will be. The more asymmetrical, the more dynamic it'll be. And I'll show you some examples of what that means. And then rhythm and movement, it's what is happening in the image and how does it draw your eye. Are we using leading lines? Are we using underlying shapes, tone to direct the eyes to focus on certain elements and give the viewer somewhere for their eyes to land? That is important. Is we want to say your eye should be here right now. Pattern, are we using repeating things because we're trying to lead people from point A to point B by creating a rhythm of boom, 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 like going from small to large with the same element. Think of a fence where the post is smaller and then as it gets closer to us, it gets bigger. That creates an order for us to follow that repetition and pattern that can lead us to seeing a specific thing. And then contrast, like how many elements of the piece appear different. So contrast can come in the terms of both hue or color. It can come as tone or value. It can come as scale, like things are bigger or smaller. And it can create dynamics within a piece. We can use things to divide compositions. We can use like golden section or divine proportion, basically a mathematical principle that has a ratio that where one part is going to be equal to the larger of the two quantities. We can use a golden section, which is dividing this up into I think thirds or eighths, so that we get like hot spots and regions and areas to focus on. And again, we've seen like these golden ratios that were used effectively quite frequently during the Renaissance by people like Da Vinci and other artists. And basically what it does is it just continually keeps breaking the image down mathematically so that we can follow and spiral down into some of the most important elements of where our eye should be led. Diagonal movement, for the most part, is one of the more dynamic elements. And in a lot of Baroque paintings, the compositions often have a primary line of movement, so this really big broad line, and then you'll get these other smaller triangles that break up the space, and you can see that those are going to be perpendicular to this blue line. Doesn't mean that you have to perfectly hang things on that line, but utilizing that to help determine how you're going to try to place elements to lead the eye around the composition and make it feel more dynamic is really useful. So you can even see in this one where a lot of the figure is grouped in this larger triangle here, and then this other smaller figure is grouped in the triangle there, but you can still see how some of the elements are flowing even here in the patterns that are creating like these nice spirals that run through the figure that draw your eye as well. So it's not a singular element to compose that image. In here too, you can see the same concept sort of utilized where you're creating like these areas where it's very dynamic, and that you can see elements that hit the hot spots to break up the space, so we get these really interesting and really dynamic diagonals that lead us around the composition. And you can also utilize 2 or more compositional elements. You don't have to settle for, I'm only going to utilize 1. And we can even see the same sort of dynamic principle here. And part of what's important here is you can see how Caravaggio used a lot of those compositional elements in terms of breaking up space with thirds and golden section. And then you can see how a modern artist, Howard Lyon, used the same compositional elements in terms of the way it's composed to break up a more modern version of that. So looking at other artists will help you to make decisions about potentially how you might want to compose images as well. So the golden triangle, harmonious triangle is a rule of thumb in visual composition for photographs or painting, especially those which have elements that follow diagonal lines. The frame is divided into 4 triangles of 2 different sizes, done by drawing 1 diagonal from one corner and then 2 lines from the other corners touching the first at 90-degree angles. So making sure that you keep those at 90-degree angles, it just makes it to where it's a system that you can use consistently instead of just making up random things. And again, you can see how the space is divided in a way where you get like areas of where there's visual interest in the triangles and areas where there's a little bit more simplicity, so that you can make sense of and move and shift things around to create that sort of energy and rhythm. And then the rule of thirds involve dividing your image using 2 horizontal lines and 2 vertical lines, as you can see here. And you then position your elements on these hot spots, so that, again, we're trying as much as possible to avoid just dropping things right in the middle of the composition. The important thing about any of the compositional devices, though, let me say this is super important. You never put down the compositional devices as a starting point. The compositional devices come after you quickly think about, hey, where do I want to place elements? And then you think about dividing it up into thirds, because if you start with compositional devices, like whether it's golden sections, whether it's harmonious triangles, whether it's rule of thirds, it will instantly stagnate your images. It'll stagnate your compositions, because you will then start to think inside of the box. The goal is never to think inside the box. The goal is to make these compositions interesting. After you thumbnail something real quick, then you want to go back and start looking at compositionally. Is this working? Is this interesting? Is this exciting? Is this dynamic? Is this reading the way I intended? Are people seeing what they're seeing? If people are going to see what you expect them to see, then the compositional device is not really necessary. However, in composing your image, if things are shifted and placed in random spots and you don't get a sense that your viewer is seeing the thing that you want to see, that's when you always go back with compositional devices and start thinking about shifting, moving things around, and saying, let me figure out how to achieve better balance. So again, the rule of thirds help immensely when achieving balance in your photography or drawings or whatever. But as much as pictures look better when things aren't all clumped together in the middle, they also won't look great with too much negative space. So including other elements that help balance out your negative space will improve your compositions. So using leading lines as well. Leading lines are natural lines that help draw the viewer's eye and pull them into the picture towards a chosen point in your image. They can be made up of anything from a road to a bridge, but where you position them in the frame will shift focus completely. So pay them some attention. So you can see even in here, I think this is a Monet. I think that's what that says. You can see how the line of the beach draws you around. The repetition of the boats lead you around, and even the rock formation leads you. And so all those leading lines are drawing you to look around the image and move through the space in a relatively organized way. Is it really likely that all these boats are moving in this position this close to a shore? Probably not. Visually though, it works really well, and it creates nice rhythm and pattern that takes you around the image and leads you out into the great expanse. So you want to try as much as you can in the process of composing your image, even when you're working with patterns, is that you don't want to get into the point where you're just making them and they become too evenly spaced, right? We're always trying to think about breaking perfect symmetry as much as possible. And it's not that you can never use symmetry. You know, in in very rigid systems. So if you're making something that's authoritarian, like something very centralized, it's useful. But for the most part, we're typically not making super authoritarian things, like where we're creating, if you're creating the throne for like a king, or like the ruler of some planet or alien or dictator, or the king of all thugs, I don't know. Typically, they will sit right in the middle upon a throne, and then their peons or their cronies will flank off to the sides, and it'll often be evenly distributed. And so that's a way of framing a subject, so to speak. So we tend to want to put things in neat little boxes, especially when it comes to composition. We do want to create that border around the subject to help really make the subject clear. So we want to utilize cropping well. So if there's elements that are important, like we want to make sure that we're paying attention to that, and that we don't put in a bunch of random things that are just a distraction from our specific thing. So we do want to have supporting elements, but we're always focused on making our focal point work and minimizing the amount of randomness of things just scattered about. So you always, even in the most mundane, even in the most simplistic of images, think about what you are expecting people to see first. We always want to be able to say, this is the first read, this is the second read, this is the third read. Even when you design characters, when you design props, when you design vehicles, environments, when you design shots, when you're animating, you always want to think about, what is the primary thing that I want people to get out of this, the secondary, the tertiary, blah, blah, blah. So you're always trying to make decisions about, what is it that I want people to see? How do I want them to read this image? How do I want them to navigate and to manage their sort of expectations? Like, that's super important. So if we look at this artist, I forget who it is, but we can even see in here that we talk about proportion, and we can even think about the proportion of figures. You can even if you don't know better, you can look and see that the proportion of the scale of this figure just doesn't look right. Her head looks small in relation to her body. His head is a little small in relation to his body. This kid kind of has an odd proportion. It looks a little bit older. Looks like an adult that's smushed down. But outside of those things, like, we've got a lot of elements that are specifically designed to create rhythms for us to move around a composition. There's an overall sort of big triangle that's already at play and at work that guides us through the image. But there's also like a nice circular sort of rhythm as well that moves around in this direction. And there's also just supporting elements in here that draw us back around compositionally, so that we get a balance of like nature and kind of debauchery, I guess. There's even like a random little pickle here that compositionally pulls us back in and takes us up. So we can even see, like, from this, I think that's a pickle. It might be something else, but it looks like a pickle. This pickle takes us in. This little bit of lace stops us from leaving the composition, draws us up. It goes right through the line of the back up to her ear, and then we see her eyes, and we look and try to then determine what's happening with her eyes. But even if we don't veer and look off to figure out what's happening with her eyes, we can go right up to where his clavicle is, this part of where his anatomy is, and we can kind of bounce back, see his eye, and then go, ooh, what's this strap? And that strap can then make us look down and see, whoa, what's happening with the arm? And then move across the arm and decide, do we want to veer to where the fingers are leading us, or should we see what's happening with that? Then we can see the glass, and then it could take us to back around, and we take another trip and say, what's happening around this direction? And then we see the grapes in his hands. We can go lead through the fingers that lead us through her arm again, that through her fingers, see what's happening with the kid. And if we want, we can veer off and, surmise, is this kid looking off to that distance? Are they looking at the wine? And then we can drive through the kid, the little line across the strap into the fruit, that looks like a squash maybe. Maybe those are squash and not pickles. They look pickly. I don't know if pickles were invented then though. But that pickle then draws us back and it stops right at the leg. So then it draws us back around and we keep compositionally going in this rhythm, in this pattern, in this rhythm, in this pattern. And they're both somewhat offset. We can see that there's some diagonal, the diagonal sections across there, the long diagonal that goes across here, and another diagonal that separates there. So there's a lot of diagonal elements that break this up. We could even look at it in terms of it being thirds, that except his shoulder hits the third, probably part of her ear is going to hit the third, and then this kid's probably closer to this empty space be another third, and probably her hip will be the other third. So this is more of a harmonious triangle, like Baroque type division, but it creates like lots of rhythm and energy, and there's intention. Like these poses are not natural at all. There's nothing natural about the way that the figure is holding grapes. There's nothing natural about the way that he's touching her arm. There's nothing natural about the way she's holding that glass. There's nothing natural about the way this kid is looking up. There's nothing natural about the tilt of her head. He's probably the most natural of all of them, but even that is not that natural. The way that this kid's holding the barrel, the fingers and hands, like those are all designed to have rhythm and pattern so that they don't create even negative positive space. Even through here, these don't create even negative and positive space. They all of those elements are very asymmetrical because they break up. They're repeating patterns, but they break up the proportion and the scale enough that it keeps your eye visually interested in moving through the composition. So even when you're composing simple images, like you want to be thinking about, like, how do I create rhythm? Like even you can even look at the fruit, that the fruit are not all rotated the same direction, and that they're rotated slightly different directions. That even though they're repeating, that they're not repeating perfectly the same. And those are thoughtful, specific, and intentional decisions that are made. There's nothing random. I don't personally know this artist because that's bajillion years ago. Like this is Baroque painting. It's like right after the Renaissance, like a long time ago. And so I don't know the artist, but I can almost be 100% certain that even down to the way that the shadows are handled, the cast shadows that fall around the arm, the shadows that wrap around the arms, like the shadows that fall across there, you could have punched those and made those way darker, especially if you look at the contrast on the cape in relation to the arm. Like even the cast shadow from her head, it's darker neck up against the body, and it gets lighter as it gets further away. All of that probably could have been darker, but to create the intentional atmosphere, to control the contrast, to get you to look at the areas and regions where, like, all of this stuff back here is designed to be very dark, so that all of this foreground stuff is really light, so that you get your figures emerging from the darkness into the light, and her figure is the most illuminated, so that we get the entirety of the subtlety of the anatomy, the softness of the form and the anatomy, and the beauty of all the figure. So there's a specific intention in the way that these figures are handled, and the more conscious you are in that effort when you're making any sort of design artwork, the more convincing whatever piece you're making will be. So be very clear, intentional in your focal point, in your decision making, whenever you're composing images, because it just makes your work that much more interesting, compelling, and dynamic.